On the podcast today, we are going to speak about Chapter 75 of the Tao Te Ching, which makes up the 75th episode of the 81 Meditations on the Tao Te Ching. And as usual, Guiyang will read Jia Fufeng and Jane English's translation, and I will read Derek Lin's translation.
Why are the people starving? Because the rulers eat up the money in taxes. Therefore the people are starving. Why are the people rebellious? Because the rulers interfere too much. Therefore the people are rebellious. Why do the people think so little of death? Because the rulers demand too much of life. Therefore the people take death lightly. Having little to live on, they know better than to value life too highly.
The people's hunger is due to the excess of their rulers' taxation, so they starve. The people's difficulty in being governed is due to the meddling of their ruler, so they are difficult to govern. The people's disregard for death is due to the glut in their ruler's pursuit of life, so they disregard death. Therefore, those who do not strive for living are better than those who value living. So this chapter is a continuation of chapter 74, but we're looking at it a lot more from the perspective of the common people as opposed to the ruler. But we are still speaking about the ruler here. This is more of a holistic approach of what happens when we meddle in people's affairs, when we don't follow the path of non-interference, wu wei.
Yes, apparently this kind of a very a raw criticism didn't exist in any other books in the contemporary time of Tao Te Ching, I think. So the Lao Tzu is very against the establishment, and the Tao Te Ching is big part of it, as we know, is to criticize the rulers' heavy taxes and how they want to interfere with the common man's life and things like that. So yes, as you mentioned, that this chapter is a good example and actually very good reflection of the outcome when the ruler becomes very interfering to people's life in the name of politics and promises and policies and whatnot to better people's life, right? But in reality, people are suffering and starving because of heavy tax duties, and people become rebellious, and people don't take death seriously, as in a way that they treat life as too cheap, right? Again, because rulers demand too much of people's life from giving heavy tax duties and all these things.
Yeah, when you don't have a happy society, people don't value their lives, right? And so we sadly see that in a lot of cultures around the world in the modern day, where, there's heavy taxes, there's inflation, there's all this and that. As a result, people don't procreate and so forth and so on. You don't have happy societies. And so people don't then value their life as highly as what they should. And to speak to what you were saying about the Tao Te Ching itself, the whole text is a politically incorrect text. And so Lao Tzu and Zhuangzi as well, who came later, are not politically correct people. They're realists, and they call it as it is. And so that's why Taoism essentially is a technology for sort of deprogramming yourself from a lot of indoctrination and conditioning that we all go through our lives. And so Taoism is kind of we could say it's a holistic, complete philosophy, because we're not just focusing on the spiritual, we're also focusing on the social and the psychological, and in some sense poking fun at the political a little bit. But anyway, getting back to what we were saying with this chapter, looking at it from the common person's perspective, Lao Tzu sort of tackles it in the sense of hunger, difficulty being governed,
yes,
and also a disregard for death as a result of poor leadership, right? So with high taxations, people have less to spend, people are less happy. And you're seeing this increasing around the world. There's all sorts of taxes that just come from nowhere, right? Like a new tax for another tax for another tax. And then so people then are left with literally 20% of their earnings to just live life. And so it's hard to have a happy society when that is the result.
Yes, I mean, this chapter is actually exactly reflecting on our contemporary time, really. I mean, whenever this chapter was written thousands of years ago, it's still prevalent to this day. It's pretty ironic, and I'm pretty sure Lhasa wrote this to remind people not to be this way. But it is pretty sad that the world is still going through a very similar situation as what this chapter is talking about. And in the first world countries, people are already under huge stress of inflation, of cost of living, and heavy taxes and whatnot. And as we know, in the developing world, like India or Nepal, those countries, actually, we've witnessed that happening now, as in like a transitioning to that world, right? Like we've been going to these countries for over a decade, and we've seen the changes in the inflation and just common people's life in general, right? Because of this tax and that tax, and because that tax is for this and this is for this, and like all these things, and comes down to common people's hands and becomes a huge burden, and people who are selling tea on the street for 20 rupees, 30 rupees, it becomes more difficult for those people's life, and they need to live, and they need to raise children, and they need to go to the hospital as well. But how are they going to be able to afford all these things under heavy tax duties and whatnot? So naturally people become rebellious, right? And they have lots of complaints, and they have fair points to point out to government how they go about things in a wrong way, and so they don't have any fear of death because they're just busy keeping up with life, right? So as an example, in the developed world, or even Far Eastern Asian countries, they literally taking their own lives, and those numbers only increasing, and the very low fertility rate is showing that very evident of that.
Yeah. And when you have governments, or when you yourself may meddle in someone else's life, let's say if you meddle in a friend's life, you're just interfering with their life. And what happens as a result in interfering with someone's life, or in this sense the government interfering with the people and not following the path of Wu Wei and allowing people's natures to run their course, is you force people to be overly involved in life. So you have to be overly involved. You have to fight for survival. You're not just chewing a straw in the backyard, happy as Larry. They force you into a position, like you said, where you have to fight for your survival. You have to fight the government, which then you disregard your life because you will fight to the death for whatever cause that may be, right? And so it reminds me of the fisherman's story, where the fisherman is happily fishing, he's catching his fish, and this government official comes along and goes, hey, like, what are you doing? Like, shouldn't you have a job? Like, why don't you want a job? I can get you a job in the government and everything. And the fisherman's like, why would I want that? And he's like, well, if you get a job, then you can save the money. And then when you save the money, then you can eventually do what you would like to do. And he's like, so like fishing? And he's like, yeah, exactly. And he's like, but I'm already doing that.
Like, what are you talking
about? What are you talking about?
Doing what I'm doing. Yeah. why would I go out of my way to become politician? To do what I want to do?
Yeah. I'm already doing that. I'm fishing already. Like, what's the deal here? Like, is there like where's the punchline, you know?
Yeah.
But that's sort of like what's happening to all of us collectively. Like, we're being forced in this position to, you know, and to be honest, most of us are pretty simple, right? Like, we have simple desires, simple needs. And Lao Tzu talks about this in, I think, chapter 12, where he talks about the desires of the eyes and the desires of the belly. And so the desires of the belly is like the fisherman. You know, he's happy as Larry. He's fishing. He's having a small portion of fish every now and again. You know, probably enjoying some rice wine every other night. Happy as Larry, right? So the desires of the belly are just those intrinsic desires we have for food, clothing, and shelter, where the artificial desires are these desires that you can see in the distance. They're far away, but it's like keeping up with the Joneses. So you want to keep up with society, you want to get that Ferrari, you want to get that mortgage for the house, and so forth. So these artificial desires are always unattainable, but they keep you on this hamster wheel in society. Think of Madison Avenue, right? Think of Madison Avenue. Think of the advertising industry. This is what the desires of the eye are. And so common people want to be left alone and are happy with simple desires. But when you inculcate these artificial desires in people's lives, then you confuse them. Then they're looking in the distance. When originally they just wanted to go fishing, right? They only wanted to go fishing. That was what their innate desire was. That was their lead, their organic pattern was to be a fisherman, right? But then society says, no, but you can be a politician, you can be a politician, you can make a lot of money, and then when you retire at 65, 70, then you can go back to fishing and living life again. It's like, but what's the point? Why would I sacrifice 50 years for that? And so this is where we all get it wrong. We have simple desires, simple needs, but we often are looking outward at the world. We externalize our desires, and the artificial desires, the desires of the eye, confuse our mind, and then we start chasing these desires that we didn't even know existed prior, right? And so then we stay on this hamster wheel for 10, 20, 30, 50, 60 years chasing this fool's gold, which never comes. And so that's one of the big problems. And this is what governments do, and this is what actually we impose this on ourselves too, if we don't have a clear mind about what's going on around us.
Without the influence of the society, I think we all are in a way that we were a fisherman. We were already completely fine with our lives, and just the basic needs are taken care of. Once that's taken care of, like happy as Larry, you just go about your day and do what you like to do, and you don't have any stress of being somewhere on time and doing something correctly and this and that. But this influence of society from like outside influence that comes to us and talking to us that look at this, we have a smartphone 20 this year, new thing. Look at these new functions, gadgets and all this. And we certainly don't need that, obviously. But because our mind is playing this game of trick, like, oh, look at that, like, that's shiny and much nicer than what you have, and you can do even this or that, and it's attractive, like it's a new thing, right? We get attracted to these new objects, and becomes they commodify our mind, right? So that they continuously give out these temptations to fire the artificial desires, which we don't really need it at all. Yeah, we need to be aware that these social influence is actually, again, somewhat ruining our innocence and actually our life entirely. That is why here is saying no fear for death, right? Because you don't treat your life with the preciousness, with the precious thing, so that you don't learn to live life well, so that you kind of not that you become fearful of death. It's more like you embracing the course of nature as a part, death as part of the nature.
Yeah, and that's kind of the holistic perspective of this chapter about how do we survive in this materialist world, right? This world around us. So you and I, we've always usually been able to reduce our life to one big bag. Now we reduce it to two big bags because we have the studio equipment. So, but that's always been us. We, no mortgages, no cars, none of that. Always keep it grounded and keep it simple and keep our life about what matters. Right, what really matters, right? A mortgage doesn't matter. And so it's about how do we survive materially, like what you were saying, like all of these artificial desires, we're looking over the fence, we want this, we want that, and none of that can define who you truly are. And a good example of this is, when we talk about especially like a disregard for death, because when you confuse people this much, right, and you've got them so interwoven with the material world, so interwoven with these artificial desires, that this is what can lead someone to have a disregard for death. So a good example is celebrity suicides, right? Like a celebrity, for example, can have all the money in the world, all the fancy cars, all the homes, all the clothes, you name it. Think of the brand, they've got it, right? They got $500,000 watches and this and that, but they're completely empty inside because they bought into this illusion of the desires of the eye, a complete and utter illusion. And so they bought into that wholeheartedly, and in the end of the day, they're impoverished spiritually. And that's the slippery slope for all of us, because a lot of us are chasing money, we're chasing fame, we're chasing notoriety. And look, sometimes the financial number we're chasing is different according to, people's sort of place in life. But we're still chasing regardless. And we think that once we get there, there's going to be this gold, but it becomes this full gold. And we become impoverished spiritually as a result, right? And so we're not nourishing our soul in going to that sort of goal that we have maybe financially or materialistically. And so I think that's a good example of what can happen when we become so confused with all of these desires of the eye, when the government, for example, can force you into a position where you're paying a lot of tax, and then you want to save more, and then you want to strive to make more money. You have this mindset, this number in your mind which is going to free you, and so then you fight the government as a result, and then your whole life is like this whole cycle of survival, where, like I've said always, like we always transplant our natural survival tendencies when we were on the savannah to the modern day, but it's more psychological, right? And so our survival tendencies are kind of entangled with our psychology. And so then we make all of these goals for ourselves. We're fighting for our own survival and this and that. And okay, if we realise that the government are doing this to us, to you and the general population, then you have to manage yourself better then. The responsibility then falls on you, not to essentially fight the government, but how can you manage yourself better? Can you get rid of these desires of the eye that are confusing you and draining your bank account? But the government keeps saying, hey, this is what's good for you, this is what's good for you, this is what's good for you, even though you've got all these high taxes and inflation and everything else going on. But then people are still buying the Louis Vuitton, they're still buying the Lamborghinis. Yeah. They're buying all these things that they don't need because they think that that's what's going to define them as a person, right? And so that's when we have a complete disregard for death. And so, but the irony is that when you relinquish all of these desires of the eye and you harmonize with the desires of the belly and you join the fisherman on the lake, then that's when you become nourished spiritually. Your mind is then not occupied with what you don't have, it's occupied with what you have. And that's a fundamental difference between those who are a victim in this chapter as opposed, like in the last two lines where Derek says, therefore those who do not strive for living are better than those who value living, which is a very difficult translation to understand. Derek even says it himself that these two lines are difficult to understand. But when you understand it from that sort of desires of the eye and desires of the belly mentality, it makes complete sense, because the fisherman knows. The fisherman doesn't need anything. Yeah. They're not consumed by this ambition in life, striving to be someone, to have all of these material needs. They don't value any of that. They value friendship, they value full belly, they value peace and quiet while they sit at the lake fishing.
If you were to just make complaints to the government and hit the street and make a big scene in the protest and telling them what they're doing wrong and how they should be doing things and change their policy and this and that, we know that all that's going to be absurd, right? It's not going to work. It never worked, so it never will. So in a way that when we are younger, we all had a rebellious mentality somewhat, and we protest and make a big scene on the public and this and that. But instead of wasting our time and energy doing that, like you said, we need to have a good look at ourselves. And we are driven by, honestly, we are driven by these commercials and these, like a social status and things that you need to achieve in life and this and that. But that is, in the end, we need to realize the desire of the eyes, really. It's not the essential needs or essential things that we need to really maintain our life. It's more so to look after ourselves and what is really making us happy and actually sustainable of living our own life, right? We always find it hard to find the contentment in our life. Why? Because we are chasing the desire of the eyes. We are chasing what others accomplished and what others are doing and this and that. We always like to compare things, right? But at the end of the day, as you said with the celebrities, their life, a lot of the cases actually, they live in misery. They also struggle to keep up with their own image, right? That we don't know that they don't talk about it, obviously. So in a way that we need to kind of accept ourselves as we are, as in a beautiful way, actually. The life that we have is it's fine. There's nothing wrong with it until we think it's something wrong with it, right? Because of that cult of comparison. Yep. But if you get out of the mindset and we just seeing the world as it is, and when you look at that way, everyone is doing their thing, their role, playing their role harmoniously, organically, and beautifully, actually. So when you come from that place, your life is just fine. So you're no longer chasing that desire of the eye, but you're trying to fulfill your desire of the belly, which is just a natural desires. And what people would say, what about your creative desires? What about your passion on something? Well, that is also beautiful too. That's completely natural. That's something that your heart is telling something to you to create something. That could be a writing, that could be a music, that could be anything, right? So that is just a pure expression of your own existence. And yeah, you just express yourself as you normally would, organically would, but not to chase these desires of I.
And that would be your li, your organic pattern, your intrinsic nature, right? Whatever that may be, writing, gardening, whatever comes to you easy. But to speak with what you were saying about you can't change the governments and this and that, sometimes when you fundamentally want to change the government is you need to listen to this chapter and kind of like what we've been saying and then fundamentally change yourself. Because it's through the people that changes the government, right? Like, so if you're not consumed by the artificial desires, the desires of the eye, and say if more people aren't consumed by that, then you force the government's hand to change their ways. Like you said, like it's rare that there has been a government upheaval from the people throughout history because the governments are covert in what they do and very cheeky, and a lot of people don't really know the name of the game that's happening around them. But for those of us who do know and do know that they are not following the path of Wu Wei, it's up to us to follow the path of Wu Wei, fundamentally change ourselves, not be consumed by the desires of the eye, like what Lao Tzu is saying in this chapter, and begin to live happy. And that's infectious to people around you, right, is to live happy. You don't need to become an activist. You just need to reorient your own life, and you need to reorient it towards the Tao. And that's actually how we fundamentally change other people and also the institutions that we believe are above us, but they're not. They're at the will of the people, but we've just forgotten that. So guys, we hope you enjoyed, and we'll see you guys next time.